could be produced by the state was weak to non-existent, while the counter evidence was often overwhelming, that there was serious doubts about whether any of these quote-unquote mitigation measures mitigated anything at all. And it was on that basis that he rejected their decision. He noted their logic was internally contradictory, externally contradictory to existing evidence. It didn't even make sense within its own rules, and it was often nothing more than a theoretical white paper being imposed on the population of Pennsylvania to their great expense and detriment. He noted that, in fact, there was no evidence that public gatherings of the kind that they were trying to be suspended or prohibited, or assembly that was being restricted and listed as unlawful, had caused any form of super-spreading event that led to any mass deaths of any kind. Indeed, the only kind that had been was the nursing home policy of Pennsylvania and Michigan and New York and New Jersey had done, where they forced people who were sick and elderly back into the nursing home to infect the rest. But it wasn't lawful assembly that posed any degree of health threat by any of the documented or detailed evidence. Yet it had been suspended throughout Pennsylvania, not for days, not for weeks, as originally promised, but for months and months and months with no end. As he pointed out, a quarantine is supposed to be sick-specific. The person who you have clear and convincing evidence that a particular person presents an imminent risk to other people within the community. Fits the same constitutional due process standards we've had for involuntary institutionalization of the mentally ill. The same standards apply to the medically ill. These lockdown orders were not consistent with any form of public quarantine, and the state would admit during the proceedings that, in fact, it could not meet the definition statutorily or as constitutionally permitted of a quarantine. Instead, they came to a different defense. What was their defense? There's no fundamental right to make a living, period. That was their argument, and they expected a court to accept it, adopt it, and impose it on the rest of us. That no American, no Pennsylvanian in that case, had any fundamental right to make a living, to support their family, to support themselves. Apparently the words pursuit of happiness no longer appeared in the new Declaration of Independence as written by the Pennsylvania governor. Indeed, despite the fact that the right to make a living was fundamental and established as such from the very inception of our Constitution and repeated as such going back to decisions from the 1800s, somehow that was completely ignored and wished to be obliterated by the new Democratic regime in the state of Pennsylvania. They admitted that their definition of quote-unquote life-sustaining businesses, which were given an exception and an exemption from the gathering provisions and the assembly provisions, had no definition at all. There was no standard for it. There was no policy behind it. It changed day to day, week to week. It was like something the Stasi or the Politburo would have come up with. Indeed, as the court noted, it failed to meet even the most basic constitutional standards of governmental action. And it was for that reason that the court determined and rejected what the governor of Pennsylvania said there is indeed a right to make a living, there is indeed a right to assemble, and that these rights cannot be suspended in the name of an emergency. They cannot be declared invalid unilaterally by the actions of the executive branch of any government. And he concluded in this way, and it's a conclusion we should all remember as we move forward in the cases that I and other lawyers will be bringing across the country in the name of this case. And here is his final quote. "The liberties protected by the Constitution are not fair-weather freedoms. The Constitution cannot accept a, quote, new normal, where the basic liberties of the people can be subordinated to open-ended emergency mitigation measures. The Constitution sets lines, and these actions cross those lines." Let it be so across the country. Thank you.
With apologies to our other two speakers, I'm not sure how you follow that. No, I'm sure they will do very well. And our next speaker is Alex Berenson. He graduated from Yale University in 1994 with degrees in history and economics. He was a reporter at the Denver Post and then at TheStreet.com. In 1999, he joined the New York Times. And at the Times, he covered everything from the drug industry to Hurricane Katrina, and then he served 2 stints as a correspondent in Iraq, an experience that led him to write The Faithful Spy, which was his debut novel. He has now written 12 John Wells novels and 2 nonfiction books. the number, and tell your children. Please welcome Alex Berenson.
So, as you might guess from that pedigree, I didn't really expect that I would be spending all my time speaking to conservative groups and audiences for the last couple of years, but here I am. And I've been forced into your hands. And the reason I've been forced into your hands is that the left does not want to talk about data and science as much as they say they do. And certainly when it comes to coronavirus, they don't. Science is not Dr. Anthony Fauci saying this is what science is, and it's not somebody saying we all follow the science. You must follow the science. As my mother, who's an inveterate MSNBC watcher, says to me, I just follow the science, and I say you have no idea what the data says, and what science is at its heart is examining data sets, clinical trials, coming up with theories that fit the data you have, trying to test those theories, trying to reproduce them, people being able to reproduce the data independently, whether it comes out of a lab or whether it's real-world data. It's not magic, and it is something we can debate and discuss, and that's what we should be doing. But the left and the media have sort of grabbed the reins of this in a way that I never would have expected, and they refuse to debate anything they don't like. I have a couple 100,000 followers on Twitter, which is sort of my main outlet to get some of these points across, and I have been blocked by I don't know how many people who I've never even heard of, media types, what I call blue checks, who have lots of followers, who just don't, who are so opposed to hearing anything they don't want to hear that they've preemptively blocked me. This is not how discourse moves forward. So just to talk a little bit about the failure, which is actually both a failure and a crushing success of expertise, because the public health establishment has really crushed any debate. The first signal failure came with the failure of the models in March and April. So there were predictions made that the hospitals in New York and elsewhere would be overrun. And those predictions weren't made out of nowhere, okay? They weren't made out of thin air. The theory was, and this is true, it takes a week to 2 weeks after you're infected with the coronavirus to become sick enough to be hospitalized, depending on your age and your comorbidities and the viral load that you got. And obviously most people who are infected with the coronavirus never even know it. That now appears to be clear based on the serology tests showing that many, many more people are infected than we have than we know were actively infected. That suggests that many people were infected and recovered without even knowing it. But some group of people who are infected will become sick. And it takes a little while for them to become sick, and it takes a little while longer for them to be hospitalized, and then, for that tiny fraction of people who are unfortunate enough to wind up in the ICU or ultimately to die, that takes a little while longer too. So in mid to late March, as the numbers were increasing in New York City especially, the fear of epidemiologists was those numbers show what happened on, for example, the number of hospitalizations on March 22nd shows the number of infections on March 10th, but there was no lockdown on March 10th. So if the virus is spreading quickly through the New York City population, by the time we actually locked down, which was March 22nd, those 12 days there would have been a huge, huge rise in infections. And that rise would have led to an overwhelming rise in hospitalizations in the next 12 days. That was the fear, okay? That's really where all of this comes from, that fear. That didn't happen. The models failed in late March and they failed in April. They failed basically in real time. You could see it happening. This is how I first got attention, because I just pointed out, here's what the models say should be happening. They say that 50 to 70,000 people in New York State should be hospitalized, and the real number is about 15,000, and it's not going up very fast. That meant basically that the lockdowns had failed because, follow me here, if the lockdowns worked, there would have been this huge spike in cases, and then that spike would have dropped off very, very rapidly as the lockdowns kicked in and new infections stopped. Instead, there was a much shorter spike, a lower spike that didn't reach the levels that were predicted, and it went on and on and on, suggesting that the lockdowns hadn't really been effective and that the virus wasn't as dangerous as we thought. Far fewer people were being hospitalized. That all by itself should have led to a huge reconsideration of what we were doing. It did nothing of the sort. And 6 months later, the same people who wanted those lockdowns in March are calling for a second wave of lockdowns, despite 6 months of real-world evidence that A, they don't work, B, the hospital system can manage, even in places like Houston and Phoenix and Miami that were hit this summer. There was no hospital crisis. There were crowded hospitals, yes. There was no hospital crisis. That should call into question everything that we thought we were doing in March. And to go back further, this panic was not just predictable, it was predicted. Some of the same experts who now are desperate for masks and lockdowns and other public health interventions before March warned about this. They said, there's a real chance we're going to panic at the wrong time, that we're going to impose all these incredibly expensive and complicated and society-destroying and school-destroying and economy-destroying public health measures that don't really work. We need to be careful about that. And then when March came, and you can see some of these people saying this in January and February, okay, as the Chinese were locking down in Wuhan and Hubei, they said, we don't think this is a great idea. And in March, that all flipped. The public health establishment went crazy, and it has not been able to pull itself out of the ditch. And we are stuck fighting them with facts and data that they don't want to hear. But because so much of the media outside the conservative media won't even talk about this stuff, it's very hard to have an honest debate or discussion. And so here we are now, 6 months later, fighting about masks and about test and trace and isolate and about a vaccine and whether that should be mandatory when it comes. Meanwhile, in the real world, the virus has killed almost nobody under 60, and certainly almost nobody under 60 who wasn't quite ill. I'm not saying there are not cases, okay? But if you look at who actually gets sick and dies from the coronavirus, it is overwhelmingly people who are either extremely elderly or extremely sick or both. That's why 40 to 50% of all the deaths from the coronavirus occur in people in nursing homes and long-term care facilities. And by the way, that does not mean it's not real. It does not mean we shouldn't try to help people who are at risk. It does not mean those deaths don't matter. All the things people like to say about me, I don't think any of those things. What it means is that we have to balance society's, our responsibility to all of society, and especially to children, to our responsibility to the people who are, in many cases, at death's door. Okay, there's something called, when you're doing bookkeeping, you have to look at assets and liabilities. You have to look at both sides of the ledger. This can't just be about trying to protect a few 100,000 people who are very sick anyway. It has to be about all of society, especially since we have next to no evidence that any of those measures that we undertook did any good. I mean, that's the icing on the cake on this, is that we don't even know that anything we did worked. But we have this overwhelming desire to do something, to do anything. I mean, the older I get, the more I understand that intelligence is important, but so much less important than intelligence, or so much more important than intelligence, is the ability to stay cool and calm under pressure and in dangerous times. Okay, give me the guy or the woman who can stay cool under fire okay? We panicked. We had an overwhelming desire to do something, even though there was no evidence for what we were doing. The simplest public health measures are the ones that work. Stay home if you're sick. Wash your hands. Don't spit on the ground. We used to spit on the ground all the time in this country. There were spittoons everywhere. We don't do that anymore. I mean, really, like, you know, sneeze into your elbow. That's about it. Okay, that's about all that we know works. Everything else is questionable to a greater or lesser extent. And masks are, I would say the evidence is near zero that anything but a properly fitted N95 mask does much of anything. Okay, and there's evidence that masks actually may be counterproductive because they discourage people from doing these other things. And to the extent masks make a difference, they probably make a difference as a signaling mechanism. In other words, if we tell sick people to wear masks, it signals to other people that they're sick, and then people give them space. Doesn't mean you're being negative about them. It just means you're giving them some space that they're sick. But guess what? When you have universal masks, that signaling mechanism disappears. It destroys the only benefit of the mask. So we are stuck. And the reality of the situation and what the media and public health establishments are saying are diverging more and more. And people are getting fed up, and they're sort of throwing, we're all, not all of us, but a lot of us, I think, are living in what, to some extent, must have felt like in the Soviet Union about 1982, when it was clear that that everything had failed, and that you couldn't get any fresh fruit, and your car, if you were lucky to have one, the engine fell out half the time. But you had to, but everybody said the glorious socialist state was going on. We are being told over and over again that this is the worst, epidemic since the Spanish flu, when most people don't know anyone who's died from this, and certainly most people don't know anyone who's died from this. And I mean, when I say most, I mean almost all. I've conducted a survey about this, and and there's been other surveys conducted about it. Somewhere between 80% and 90% of Americans don't know anyone who's died from COVID, and most of the people who and you define know as broadly, okay? So not a family member, but just somebody you might have heard of who's a friend or something like that. So most people don't know anyone who's died from COVID, and the people who know someone who's died from COVID, those deaths overwhelmingly again are in people who are older and quite ill. So the reality of the fact that this isn't that dangerous to most people, to almost all people, and what we're being told is the gap is getting too far for anybody to accept anymore. And so people are returning to their lives, but they're doing it in the face of government diktats that are supposed to, that I guess we're all sort of saying are not going to be enforced. So, Kamala Harris said, there'll be a mask mandate, but we won't enforce it. So what does that mean? I mean, really? Like, is it just a strongly worded suggestion? Like, I don't know. So that doesn't breed respect for government or the law or science or anything else. It's a bad way to live when what you see happening and what you're being forced to pretend in public is happening are not the same thing. And I hope we can stop that. I could talk for an hour. I mean, this is, to some extent, this is like the old AA stuff. 5 minutes is too much, and an hour would not be enough. But I want to sort of leave you with one thing. It's very easy to say this is all about Trump. Okay, that, the media hates Trump, or unfortunately, there's a lot of people in academia, including in the physical sciences, who hate Trump. If Trump is not reelected, this will go away. The evidence on the ground is that is not true. Okay, New Zealand and Australia are both led by progressives. They have extremely hard lockdowns. Okay, and Joe Biden has indicated that he will follow the science, the same science my mother follows on MSNBC, and basically continue masks and impose another lockdown at the drop of a hat. So it's easy to blame this on sort of the hatred for Trump, but that misunderstands what's happening here. Okay. To some extent, we are doing this because we can. What do I mean? I mean, we now have the bandwidth that most white-collar workers can stay home, okay? And we can run schools in this horrible way, but theoretically schools can function at a distance. Even 5 years ago, that would not have been possible, okay? Much less 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So we have the bandwidth to enable us to exist remotely, or, you know, for the people who have the most money and the most political power in society to exist remotely. And we have a bunch of companies that are benefiting massively from this. Tech companies, I don't, you know, if any of you are fortunate enough to own Amazon or Apple, those stocks have done really well this year. The market is not stupid, okay? So we have the ability to do this, and we have an interest group, an ultra-powerful interest group, by the way, which is now actively censoring people like me and Bob, that is encouraging this. That's A, and that's not going away, okay? That force is only becoming more powerful. B, in 1960, I couldn't believe this when I looked it up. I knew that the number would be low, but I didn't know how low it would be. In 1960, the United States spent $27 billion on medical care, okay? Even adjusted for inflation, it was $230 billion. That was about 5% of GDP. Healthcare is now 20% of GDP. It is almost $4 trillion. It is a massive and massively powerful sector in the economy. And we're spending almost $1 billion a week on tests for COVID alone, okay? Patients are a throughput when you run a healthcare company. You need patients. I'm not saying that this was created for that, but what I am saying is that the power to supercharge this rather modest epidemic into something that has shut down society has been driven by two incredibly powerful sectors of the economy, both of which benefit. And those trends are only going to get worse. Tech is only getting more powerful, and healthcare is only becoming larger as a part of the economy. So we're kind of lucky this time. This one wasn't bad enough to actually be what they wanted it. I'm not going to say wanted, that's the wrong word. It wasn't bad enough to actually force us to shut down society in the way that some people, I don't want to say hope, but in the way some people encouraged us to do. But there will be another flu. There will be an H1N1. There will be something else. And if the infection fatality rate on that is 0.5%, let's say, instead of, you know, 0.2% or 0.3%, or whatever this one is, whatever fraction this is, the pressure will be even more overwhelming to force us back into lockdown, back remotely. The experts are not going away. These trends are not going away. And that is why it is so important to fight this battle and to talk about what the data and the science actually say. And so, so we just have to keep doing it, because otherwise we're never going to get out of this.
Thank you. And our third panelist is John Hinderegger. John spent 41 years as a litigator in Minnesota. Upon his retirement from the legal profession, at the end of 2015, he became president of the Center for the American Experiment, which is Minnesota's conservative policy organization. And in addition to his legal and think tank work, John, as many of you know, is a longtime commentator and activist. He founded the website Powerline in 2002, and he has been a prominent voice on the internet and elsewhere since that time. He has appeared as a commentator on almost all major networks. He's a frequent guest and guest host on national and local radio programs, and he's lectured at many colleges and universities, although I don't know if he's been invited recently. I meant to ask him about that when I saw that in his bio. So please join me in welcoming John Hinderegger.
Thank you very much. COVID-19 is a medical event, to be sure, but arguably it is just as much a political event. And I'm afraid that what it says about the current state of our politics is not positive. When news of the Wuhan flu first arose, the immediate reaction from almost everyone was, what is the government, in particular the federal government, going to do about it? We've seen endless references to government, President Trump and the governors, handling the coronavirus, and heard about things government is doing to fight the virus. Now, this is a very different reaction from past epidemics. In 1968, the Hong Kong flu killed 1 million people worldwide and more than 100,000 in the U.S. when our population was much smaller. I was a college student in 1968, and I have no memory of a virus going around at that time. Schools and businesses were not shut down, and no one imagined that it was the government's job to handle or to fight that virus. It wasn't even much of a news story. It has been pointed out that the Woodstock Music Festival was held while the Hong Kong flu epidemic was still going on in 1969, and that is true. To say that there was no social distancing at Woodstock would be an understatement, but at the time, no one thought anything about it. But that was a different era. Today, most Americans seem to have lost the idea that our government is supposed to be limited, especially the federal government, and that government is not omnicompetent. In 1976, a Democratic politician criticized Hubert Humphrey. He said, quote, "I think the thing that's most wrong with Hubert Humphrey is that he is not cognizant of the limited, finite ability government has to deal with people's problems." Who said that? Joe Biden. We've come a long way since then in our expectations of government, and not in a good direction. Now, the second striking fact about the politics of coronavirus has been the willingness of Americans to put up with, and for the most part to endorse, fundamental restrictions on their freedoms. In state after state, we have seen governors issue stay-home orders that literally directed Americans to stay in their houses except to the limited extent they were permitted to go out by the government. Would prior generations of Americans have submitted meekly to orders to stay in their homes, close their businesses, and so forth? I don't think so. And the shutdowns in nearly every state have dragged on for months, long after the original flatten the curve rationale has been forgotten. The shutdowns are starting to feel permanent. And by the way, do you even remember that, when there was an explicit rationale for the shutdowns? This is just brief, it's just temporary, we're just trying to flatten the curve. Same number of infections, just spread over a longer period of time. That whole rationale has now completely gone by the boards. Most recently, mask mandates have been added, and almost all Americans have dutifully donned masks, even though we have no idea whether they're actually doing any good. So why has there been relatively little political pushback against the shutdown orders? I think there are several reasons. First, the emergency posed by COVID-19 has been grossly exaggerated, to an extent that I think can only be seen as deliberate. Remember that early on, government at all levels purported to be acting in reliance on models that predicted millions of deaths in the United States. My own state, Minnesota, created its own model that predicted more than 70,000 deaths in our state without a shutdown, and 50,000 deaths with a shutdown. We learned later that the model had been created by a few graduate students over a weekend, but by then it was too late. All of these models turned out to be ridiculously off target. But instead of saying, oops, never mind, governors simply kept in place the lockdown orders that originally had been predicated on them. Now, I think the Centers for Disease Control has also contributed to the public's exaggerated sense of the virus's danger in a number of ways. One of the most important was the guidance it gave to the states to count deaths as COVID fatalities, even if COVID was not the immediate cause of death. The clearest statement I've seen of this practice came from the head of the Illinois Department of Health, who was giving a press conference, and she said, "When we classify a death as COVID-related, we are not saying that it was the cause of death." A person could be dying of cancer and be in hospice care, but if he happens also to have COVID, we will count that death in the COVID column. When we do that, we are not saying it was the cause of death. That's a very, very important point, I think. And the federal government has compounded the problem by offering cash incentives to hospitals to classify patients as COVID-related and deaths as COVID-related. Under the CARES Act, Medicare reimbursements are increased by 20% if there is a COVID diagnosis. So we are literally paying to maximize the number of reported COVID patients and COVID deaths. What all this means is that every headline that you have seen trumpeting the claim that the Wuhan virus has killed 180,000 people in the U.S., or whatever that number, wherever that number stands at the moment, every headline you've seen trumpeting that claim is wrong. What the actual number of deaths caused by COVID is, no one knows. But the scare campaign mounted by the media has given the public an impression of COVID's lethality far beyond anything promoted by CDC. You may have heard about the international survey that was done by Kext CNC. That firm asked the question, how many people in your country have died from coronavirus as a percentage of the population? In the U.S., the average response was 9%. Now, 9%, think of that. That would be around 30 million people, which is worse by 2 orders of magnitude than the most pessimistic current estimates. Now, how did the American people come to be so grotesquely misinformed? I can't read the minds of the people at the CDC, the modelers, various public health officials, reporters and editors, and so forth. But I think it is a plausible guess that the sustained overhyping of COVID was a deliberate attempt on the part of some of these people to create an issue that might cost President Trump a second term. I think we can infer that from the fact that hysterical exaggerations of COVID's lethality have been coupled with constant attacks on the president's actions in response to the virus, many of which attacks have been completely groundless and even nonsensical. So the creation of an overhyped emergency certainly helps to explain why Americans have been so accepting of limitations on their freedom. But I think there's more to the story than that. I think another reason why the shutdowns have not been more politically costly to governors is because many people don't mind them much. To a great extent, what we have seen has been shut down theater. Small businesses are closed, but as Alex pointed out, Target and Walmart are open. Meatpacking plants have frequently been hotbeds of COVID infection, but they haven't been closed down other than briefly in an individual case in response to a particular outbreak. Why is that? Well, it's because we need meat in the grocery stores. Without meat in the grocery stores, voters would get restless. And I think the ultimate proof of the shutdown's basic lack of seriousness is that while it is deemed too dangerous in many states to go to church, Total Wine stores are open everywhere. Now, if you can catch a virus in a small business, a restaurant, or a church pew, you obviously can also catch it in a Target store or a Total Wine store. But governors knew that if they closed the liquor stores, there would be pitchforks in the street. And so in every state, the liquor stores have stayed open. So we've had a situation where governors have gained politically by proclaiming a grave emergency and supposedly taking strong action to combat it, while at the same time the shutdowns have been so full of exceptions that they didn't seriously inconvenience most people unless, of course, their jobs or their small businesses were impacted. As a matter of fact, you can't find any apparent correlation between the severity of a shutdown order in a given state and the number of COVID cases or hospitalizations or deaths in that state. There doesn't seem to be any correlation at all. And I think if we drill a little deeper, we find another political element. The COVID shutdowns devastated small businesses, putting many thousands into bankruptcy. But big business, and Alex mentioned this too, big business has largely prospered. Thus, for example, Target, Walmart, Costco, Home Depot, Amazon, and Apple have all achieved record share prices during the COVID epidemic. This is one reason why the stock market has been so weirdly buoyant after the initial shock in the spring. So big business is largely happy with the shutdowns. Well, who else hasn't been bothered much by the lockdowns? Public employees. I assume there are exceptions here and there, but generally public employees have simply continued to draw their paychecks and in some cases to get raises, whether they were actually performing any work or not. That doesn't give them much to complain about. Who else hasn't minded the pandemic? Urban knowledge workers. These folks, for the most part, are able to do their work at home and on Zoom, and many of them prefer it that way. For many urban knowledge workers, the shutdowns have mostly been a plus. Now ask yourselves, what are the key constituencies of the Democratic Party? They are big business, not all of it, but most of it, public sector employees, and urban knowledge workers. And as it happens, those are the constituencies that have generally been least injured by the shutdowns. Now, on the other hand, what are the key constituencies of the Republican Party? Small business in rural America, the very elements of our society that have been devastated by the COVID shutdowns. Is that a coincidence? I don't know, but I'm sure that the Democratic governors who generally have imposed the most drastic shutdowns were well aware that their own supporters were less likely to be damaged and to protest than the other parties. It has been widely reported that Republicans tend to oppose lockdown orders more than Democrats and are more likely to resist mask mandates and social distancing orders as well. Why is that? Well, I think it is partly for the reason I just said. On the average, Republicans are probably being hurt by the shutdowns more than Democrats. But there are other reasons, too. In general, Democrats trust government more than Republicans, and Republicans are more concerned with personal freedom. We see these tendencies across the whole spectrum of political issues. Today, the general lack of serious resistance to the COVID shutdowns suggests that in the perennial tension between security and freedom, freedom is losing out. Many have also said that Republicans worry less about COVID than Democrats because they are not as risk-averse. And there's probably some truth to that, too. Obviously, risk aversion is related to how one values freedom and whether one looks to government for safety at all costs. But I would point out that the Democrats' aversion to COVID risk is highly selective. I've seen little aversion to the risk of other health conditions resulting from foregone checkups and medical care, or the risk to the mental health of many vulnerable people who are deprived of normal social interaction, or the risk to the livelihoods and the lifetime of investment of many thousands of small business owners whose dreams have gone up in smoke. I've seen no risk aversion or little risk aversion to those risks on the part of Democrats. And that makes me wonder whether those who seem to be cheering on COVID-19 at times are more interested in bringing down President Trump than anything else. Finally, these days, you can't talk about politics without turning to the polls. So I want to review briefly what the polls have been telling us over the last 5 months. And the numbers I'm going to give you come from polling done by a consortium that includes Harvard, Northwestern, a couple of other institutions, and they have polled all 50 states, starting in April and continuing to the present time. So it's a nice, consistent data set. Well, looking at those numbers, from the beginning, the respondents have not rated President Trump highly on his response to COVID. He started at 42% in April, declined steadily to a low of 32% in July, and rebounded slightly to 34% in August. I think it is fair to say that the COVID epidemic has served the purpose that was intended in some quarters, and that is the presidential election has gone from being, in my opinion, a near sure thing for President Trump at the beginning of 2020 to being today a toss-up. Now, the governors have consistently been rated more highly on their COVID performances than President Trump. In fact, as of April, every single governor had a higher COVID rating than the president. Every single governor. Now that has shifted. In August, President Trump had a higher COVID approval rating than 10 governors. Interestingly, all 10 of those low-rated governors are Republicans. Why would that be? Well, I suspect that at least one part of the reason is because Republicans at all levels of government get worse press coverage than Democrats. And I suspect that that's mostly what we're seeing there. Now, all of that said, the governor's approval in general has been slipping. In late April, the governors collectively had a 63% approval rating on COVID. That has been declining, and it stands at 48%, down 15 points in August. Now, one hopes that that reflects growing impatience with the shutdowns, the mask mandates, and so on. There are a few bright spots in the polling. For example, Governor Newsom of California has gone from 70% COVID approval in April to 47% in August. But in general, the polling suggests that people tend to approve the most the governors that have gone the farthest in limiting their freedom. So I will wrap up by noting that the political games surrounding COVID-19 are far from over. The Trump administration is rushing to get a vaccine tested, approved, and distributed by the end of the year. So now we see the spectacle of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris turning anti-vaxxer and saying that they won't take, or they may not take, any vaccine that is produced by the Trump administration. So the politicizing of the Wuhan virus is going to continue until November and well beyond. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you to each of our presenters. We're going to present them with some questions, and we're going to go to the audience in a moment, but I wanted to start with one of my own, and this really could be taken, I think, by any of our panelists. And my question is, what can be done, if anything, about the censorship on the of the relevant scientific data? Maybe, Mr. Berenson, this is most relevant to your presentation. In other words, if we ever want to be in a position to have any kind of public airing or serious public debate, the censorship in the private tech platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and others, it seems if we can't lick that problem, we'll never have any serious public debate. And so I wonder if you or any of the other panelists have any thoughts on that.
I mean, that strikes me as almost a more legal question. What do, you know, whether they're, I mean, these are private companies, so.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the problem is the monopolization of the public square by private monopolies, which there was a time when, you know, company towns back in the 1920s, 1930s decided that their solution to things like mining organizers and labor unions was, well, if we just own the whole town, then they can't organize anymore and they can't assemble anymore. And the answer of the courts in a separate case later on was, the U.S. Supreme Court at the time, was if you choose to privately monopolize part of the public square, then you are as bound by the First Amendment as any public entity, because it's a combination of a monopoly plus part of the public square. That decision was followed up in a case called Pruneyard by the state of California, which applied it to private malls, which said that the public space within a private mall was really a public square. The mall had chosen to monopolize ownership and control of that space, so as a condition of its continued existence, it would be required to have First Amendment application. Logically, given that almost all of the big tech companies are based in California, you might think that they would apply the same Pruneyard principles to the private monopolization of the public square, particularly by companies that came to monopolize the public square by lying to the American people. Twitter promised to be the free speech wing of the free speech party. You can ask Alex how that's working out. You can go to YouTube, it's even worse. Google's even worse. Facebook, even worse. The degree of censorship to where now doctors, including doctors advising President Trump, are having their medical reports taken down from YouTube because it disagrees with the World Health Organization, which by that standard, everything the World Health Organization publishes should be brought down because they've disagreed with themselves, particularly about the Wuhan virus. It was, after all, the World Health Organization that told everybody back in January, don't worry, there's no human-to-human transmission with COVID. So the only, unfortunately, what the courts have done, it's even more egregious in many contexts than what they've done in the COVID responses, is they have chosen to say these are private companies and interpreted Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to give them broad-scale immunity. They interpret it as like a political license for these companies to do whatever they want, and they say it preempts all state law, and they refuse to apply any constraint to these companies. The idea that some of us had, we recommended to Senator Hawley several years ago, and Senator Hawley's now proposed legislation. And I think the only remedy is going to come from Congress. It has, because the courts are functionally closed until Congress sends a different message, is to give a carrot and a stick. If they want immunity as a publisher for things other people publish on their platforms, then they have to abide by First Amendment restrictions. And if they will abide by that, there's a big body of First Amendment law that precludes pornography, precludes child pornography, precludes harassment, precludes stalking, precludes obscenity, is not within its contours of its protections, that if they want the special immunity that Section 230 provides, that's the carrot. Then the stick is they have to abide by the First Amendment restrictions once they reach a certain economic dominance place. In other words, once they have the equivalent of a monopoly over any part of the public square, more than 75% control is how the antitrust laws tend to define it, which is what Twitter, Facebook, and Google currently have. And Google has it in the YouTube space through visual, and then has it in the search space through the internet. Then they have to abide by First Amendment restrictions. And almost every one of those big tech companies will take that trade-off. So that's the legislative solution that I think is the only solution, because until then, they will do whatever they want, and they've exposed that very badly in this context.
Okay, I think John wants to get in.
I think there's one other possibility. These big tech platforms, I think, are monopolies. Currently, monopoly law doesn't really address any evil of monopoly other than high prices. But that's not inherent. I think that the law of monopoly could be developed in such a way that there are other wrongful conduct that monopolists can engage in that could be redressed in the courts, and impinging on freedom of speech could be one of those forms of monopoly misuse. So I think that is a legal development that could potentially come out of the Supreme Court if we ever had a conservative Supreme Court.
Can I just add, I think this is a very, very dangerous trend on a couple of levels. I think when honest debate and discussion are squelched, it drives people to believe in conspiracy theory, real conspiracy theory. It will drive, people to 4chan and 8chan. It will. I mean, I don't know very much about QAnon, okay, but obviously that has been becoming more popular, that sort of set of conspiracy doctrines, and when you don't allow people to have honest discussion, either in conventional or social media, they will tend to believe the worst. And you can combine that with something that I know has happened. So, for several months, people were trying to get me to talk about PCR testing and the case-demic, and I didn't really chase it because I had a few other things to chase, and because I sort of thought there's no way that, that the testing companies have their thumb on the scale to make the numbers look much worse than they are, the numbers of reported COVID infections. And it actually fell to the New York Times to report a story that ran on page A6, although it should have been on A1, and it should have been followed up by every newspaper and good investigative reporter in the country, which is we are running our PCR tests, which is how most cases of the virus are diagnosed in the United States and around the world, in a way that hugely overstates the number of people who are actively infected at any time. Okay, that's just a scientific fact. And you can find scientists, for places like the European CDC discussing this. There's a complicated technical explanation for what's going on here, but the short answer is we are overstating the number of tests, or the number of active infections hugely, which is probably also causing us to overstate the number of deaths substantially. So I didn't really think that that was possible, and I didn't chase it. Okay, just as until the last couple of weeks, I haven't really been paying that much attention to this idea that, where did the virus come from? Did it actually escape a Chinese lab, and what experiments might have been being run? Those stories are real and worth chasing, even if we don't know exactly where they're going to go. And major media outlets like the New York Times don't seem to be pursuing them. They're not pursuing them, I can only think, because when President Trump calls it the China virus, people in the media don't like it. So they don't want to pursue where SARS-CoV-2, I don't call it the China virus, because that's not its name. I call it SARS-CoV-2, where it might actually have come from. It doesn't matter what we call it. It matters whether it escaped from a Chinese lab and whether the Chinese were experimenting with it before it escaped. And that's what we should be looking at. But when major media outlets won't, they drive people to conspiracy theory, and that's dangerous for all of us.
All right, very good. So I believe we have roving microphone holders for those of you in the audience who would like to ask a question. Okay, I'm sorry, the lights are right in my eyes, so I'm having trouble seeing folks. Please.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Alex, following up on your comment, let's say that Pfizer had developed a virus and it got out of their lab, and now a million people have died. They'd be sued for $1 trillion. Now, it's pretty clear, at least from most of the evidence that I've seen, that this virus has come from a lab in Wuhan. I don't think there's a lot of evidence against it. In fact, there's none against it. There's a lot in favor of it. The Wuhan lab is owned by the Chinese government. They're therefore responsible for several $1 trillion of damages. How do you actually go about to go to the Chinese government and say, why don't you pay for your damages?
That's above my pay grade. Look, first of all, I don't think the case is proven, and in part because the science is so politicized around this as around everything else. There are a lot of prominent virologists who say that they believe this is of natural origin, that it jumped from bats to some second mammal species and then to humans. That's why we need to investigate this. As to whether or not we're going to get the Chinese, assuming we can ever investigate it, which is not clear, if you think the Chinese are going to pay a dime for this? I mean, good luck. But we need to investigate it. Even if there will never be a political consequence or an economic consequence to the Chinese, we need to investigate it, if for no other reason than that the Chinese are increasingly aggressive around the world. They're increasingly powerful and they're increasingly aggressive. And if the world is afraid to stand up to them on this, what is the lesson they're going to take from it? It's that even if this did escape, and believe me, they know where the virus came from at this point. That's for sure. Okay, if they are able to not even face a serious independent international inquiry on this, what's the lesson they're going to take? It's that they're so powerful they can do whatever they want and there will be no consequences. And that's a dangerous lesson, again, for all of us.
Okay, over here.
Hi, yeah, following up on the question about censorship and connecting it to Constitution Day. The Constitution presupposes not just a virtuous people, but a rational people. And it seems to me what's happened with the COVID virus has brought into very stark relief the question of whether we're still all a rational people. Scott Adams, the Dilbert cartoon creator, says left and right are watching different movies. We have now different conceptions of reality. I live in Northwest DC in a liberal neighborhood. I can't even talk to my neighbors anymore. It's like their brains have been taken over by aliens. So my question is this observation true? It seems like some substantial part of the population is no longer capable of rational thought. Do you agree with that? Is it permanent? Is it reversible? Is it hopeless?
Okay, who wants to take that?
Well, I'll comment on that, and there's a lot you could say about that, right? But let me just say this. I mentioned that there's this survey where the average answer that Americans gave, what percentage of our population has died from COVID, average answer 9%. Now just think about that. If 9% of the people in this country had died of COVID, your relatives, your friends, your neighbors, your co-workers, people who go to your church, they would all be dropping like flies, right? And how a person can simultaneously say, well, I don't know anybody who's died from COVID, none of my co-workers, none of my neighbors, et cetera. But then when asked that question, I think 9% of the population has died. I don't know how anybody could possibly believe that. And I think, you know, there used to be such a thing as common sense. You know, and common sense is based on a person's own experience. So if somebody came along and tried to sell a line of BS, the average person would test that proposition against his experience and his observation, and he might say, I don't think so. That's not the way I've seen it. That hasn't been my experience. It seems as if that's just gone, you know, so that now it's the guys in the white coats, you know, now it's headlines, now it's something we heard on cable news, and there are many people who seem to have obtained this ability to internalize those things without checking it against their own common sense, which I think is very dangerous.
So I would add one thing, which is people aren't very good at math. I mean, no, they're not, and we should teach like statistics. Okay, that's what should be taught in high school. Forget past algebra, forget anything, you know, trigonometry. Statistics are what people need to function in society. And so, you know, that 9% number, I actually highlighted that a couple of months ago, but the truth is people have no idea. They don't know how many people are in the country, and they don't know what 9% of the people whose population they don't know is, so they just come up with a number. They know 30 million people didn't die from COVID. They just don't know. They don't want to sound stupid. They don't want to pick a number that's too low, so they say 9%. No, really. But here, there is some hope, okay, which is there's a survey done by something called the Kaiser Family Foundation, you know, certainly not a conservative group. They've been asking people for a few months whether or not people think the worst of COVID is behind or ahead. So in July, as you were having the sort of Sunbelt spike, and the media was saying there's going to be New Yorks all over the country, 60% of the country said the worst was still ahead, 20% said the worst was behind. Okay, people have actually paid attention to the fact that that didn't happen. And so now, the most recent survey, which was done last week, 38% of the country thinks that COVID is ahead, the worst is ahead, and 38% thinks it's behind. So some people are paying attention. And people who, you know, I think the schools reopening, first of all, you know, people are going to be frustrated. Even some of those urban knowledge workers are frustrated with the fact that schools are not properly reopened. But colleges, you know, college students are zero risk, essentially zero risk from this. And they're under these incredible idiotic and draconian restrictions, and tons of them are getting positive tests, and tons of them are fine. And so that is seeping into parents, and it's seeping in to, you know, the friends of those parents, and that's, I mean, that's many millions of people. So I'm sort of hopeful that lived experience is going to help people a little bit, but it's been a slower process than I would have liked.
Yeah, I mean, your core concern is the correct one. The whole point of the public square is to make sure everybody has a little platform in that public square in order for debate to lead to truth. And debate doesn't lead to truth if you keep half of the people out. And that's effectively what the gatekeepers are doing. So the problem is you no longer can find truth if you search by Google. You look at the great work of Professor Epstein, who comes from the left. He's a Hillary Clinton backer. And he identified that even in 2016, Google was able to at least move millions of votes in the Democratic direction just by manipulating the algorithm of what search terms show up and what links show up when you do a search. And COVID has been the ultimate test case for how governors will respond. And it used to be a conspiracy theory, the idea that, like an X-Files show, that they're going to declare an emergency, and through an emergency they're just going to suspend the Constitution, and at some point you'll even have camps for people. And now we have actually people wanting to set up COVID camps in some parts of the country. So this is the kind of insanity that could only occur in a place where the public square has been shut down and censored. And that's why it's a critical concern that legislative action take place to remedy it.
Thank you. This has been an excellent panel. We could go on all morning, but actually we can't go on all morning. We'll have to call it there. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.